filled the windows of Daniel Whitmore's remote cabin as he sat by the fireplace, nursing a hot cup of coffee. Snow pounded against the wooden walls, and the temperature had dropped to a deadly low. It was the kind of night where nothing stirred, where even the wildlife burrowed deep to escape the biting cold. Daniel, a retired forest ranger, had seen plenty of harsh winters in his time, but this storm was different. It felt endless, as if the snow itself was trying to swallow the world whole. Just as he leaned back in his chair, preparing for another long, silent night, a sound made him sit up straight, a heavy thud against the porch. Daniel's pulse quickened. No one lived within 20 miles of his cabin, and no sane person would be out in this weather. He grabbed the rifle that leaned against the wall, cautiously stepping toward the door. Then, another thud, this time softer, and a sound that sent a chill down his spine, a deep, guttural whimper. Daniel slowly unlatched the door and cracked it open, bracing against the wind that threatened to rip it from his hands. He shone his flashlight into the swirling snow and froze. Lying on his porch, half buried in the snowdrift, was a massive polar bear. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The bear's fur was coated in ice, its body shivering violently. Steam rose from its muzzle as it let out another weak, pitiful sound. Its eyes, usually fierce and predatory, were sunken with exhaustion, locked onto Daniel with something he had never seen before. Desperation. The bear. This enormous, powerful predator was begging for help. Daniel had spent his entire life around animals, but this was unnatural, this was impossible. Yet here it was. The bear needed him. Every instinct screamed at Daniel to shut the door. A wild bear, especially one as large as this, was beyond dangerous. But as he watched the creature struggle to lift its head, his heart wrenched. It wouldn't survive the night. Making a snap decision, Daniel unhooked the latch on the storm door and stepped back, leaving the doorway open just enough. "If you understand me at all, big guy," Daniel muttered, "come in. But no funny business, all right?" The bear barely hesitated. With a feeble grunt, it dragged itself forward, one slow step at a time, its massive paws trembling under its own weight. It crossed the threshold and collapsed just inside the cabin, its sides rising and falling heavily. Daniel quickly shut the door, locking out the howling storm. And just like that, he had invited a polar bear into his home. As the minutes passed, the warmth of the cabin started to work its magic. The bear's violent shivering slowed, its breathing becoming steadier. That's when Daniel noticed something else: blood. A dark stain spread across the bear's thick fur near its shoulder, partially hidden beneath layers of ice. The animal had been injured, possibly shot. Daniel grabbed his first aid kit, his hands steady despite the insane situation. He had treated countless wild animals before, but never something this massive. As he knelt beside the bear, his breath shallow, he whispered, "If you let me help, I promise I won't hurt you." To his astonishment, the bear didn't growl or snap. Instead, it stretched its injured paw toward him, as if it understood. Daniel swallowed hard. Whatever had happened to this bear, it wasn't just any ordinary accident. Someone had done this, and whoever they were, they might be coming back. Daniel worked quickly, carefully cutting away the frozen fur around the wound. What he saw made his blood run cold. It wasn't fresh, but it was deep, lodged just beneath the thick muscle of the bear's shoulder. The edges were raw and inflamed, infection already setting in. Someone had shot this bear. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had spent years protecting wildlife, ensuring hunters followed the law. But poachers? They didn't care about laws. And judging by the way this bear had dragged itself to his doorstep, it had been running from something. Or someone. Daniel grabbed a bottle of antiseptic and hesitated. "This is gonna sting, big guy," he murmured. The bear lifted its massive head, locking eyes with him, and then it did something impossible. It lowered its paw onto his knee, as if asking him to go ahead. Daniel's chest tightened. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was trust. Swallowing hard, he cleaned the wound as best he could, working carefully to avoid causing unnecessary pain. The bear flinched but didn't lash out. By the time he finished, the exhaustion in the bear's eyes had taken over. It let out a deep sigh and rested its head on the wooden floor, its massive body rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Daniel exhaled shakily. He had just treated a polar bear in his cabin, and it had let him. But the bigger question remained. Who had shot it, and why? Footprints in the snow. The storm raged on through the night, but Daniel barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind set his nerves on edge. By morning, the storm had weakened, leaving behind a thick blanket of snow. Daniel put on his coat, grabbed his rifle, and stepped outside to check the perimeter. That's when he saw them. Boot prints, leading from the forest straight toward his cabin. His stomach twisted. Someone had been here, watching, and judging by the deep imprints, they had been carrying something heavy. A gun. Daniel hurried back inside, bolting the door. The bear was still resting, its eyes half-lidded but alert. "Looks like you weren't just running from the cold, huh?" Daniel muttered, gripping his rifle. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, just before sundown, a noise shattered the quiet. A knock at the door. Daniel's grip on the rifle tightened. No one ever came this far into the wilderness without a reason. Then came a voice. "Mr. Whitmore," a man called, his tone smooth but calculating. "I think you have something that belongs to me." Daniel's heart pounded. Whoever this was, he wasn't just a hunter. He was here for the bear. And he wasn't leaving without it. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he gripped the rifle tighter. The man outside knocked again, his voice smooth but firm. "Open up, Mr. Whitmore. We need to have a little talk." Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he stepped quietly toward the window, staying low. He peeked outside. A tall man stood at the door, bundled in a heavy black coat, a thick beanie pulled low over his forehead. Snow clung to his boots, and slung across his back was a hunting rifle. Daniel's stomach churned. This wasn't a lost traveler. This was a poacher, and he wasn't alone. Just beyond the tree line, barely visible against the snow, two more figures stood watching the cabin. Armed, waiting. They had come prepared. Daniel glanced back at the bear, who was still lying near the fireplace. Its golden eyes were open now, watching him with quiet awareness. They were both trapped. Daniel could feel it. This wasn't just about hunting. This was about something bigger. Taking a deep breath, he moved toward the door. Slowly, he unlatched it, but only cracked it open a few inches. "Not a good time for visitors," Daniel said evenly. "You lost?" The man smirked. "Not lost, just looking for something." His eyes flicked past Daniel, scanning the dimly lit cabin. "I was tracking a bear through this area before the storm hit," the man continued. "A real beauty, big, strong, but wounded. Figured it wouldn't get far in this cold. Thought I might find it holed up somewhere." Daniel kept his expression neutral. "Haven't seen any bears." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You sure about that?" A tense silence stretched between them. Daniel didn't know how long this standoff would last, but one thing was clear. This man wasn't leaving without answers. And if Daniel wasn't careful, neither of them might leave at all. The man took a step forward, testing Daniel's resolve. "You know, it's illegal to keep a wild animal in captivity." Daniel didn't flinch. "So is poaching." The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't lose his smirk. "Funny thing, though, this isn't just any bear. It's tagged." Daniel's mind raced. "Tagged?" The poacher leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "That bear is worth more than you can imagine, and I don't just mean for its fur." Daniel's grip on the doorframe tightened. This wasn't about hunting. This was about money. And secrets. Daniel's thoughts spun. If the bear was tagged, that meant it had been tracked by researchers, maybe even part of a conservation project. But if this man was after it, then the bear wasn't just accidentally shot. It had been hunted, deliberately. for something more than sport. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just poaching. This was smuggling, illegal wildlife trafficking. And now Daniel was caught in the middle of it. The man exhaled through his nose, clearly losing patience. He shifted his weight, his gloved fingers tightening on the strap of his rifle. "Listen, old man," he said, voice lowering to a threat. "I know that bear's in there. You can step aside or—" Crash! A deafening snarl erupted from inside the cabin. Before Daniel could react, a massive shape lunged forward. The bear was on its feet. With terrifying speed, it charged the door, knocking Daniel aside as it slammed full force into the opening. The man barely had time to stumble backward before 800 pounds of raw fury exploded onto the porch. The poacher fell back into the snow, scrambling to raise his rifle, but the bear wasn't stopping. It roared, a deep, earth-shaking sound that sent ice-cold terror through the night. The two men in the tree line shouted, raising their weapons, but the bear's rage wasn't for Daniel. It was for them. They had hunted it, wounded it, tried to finish the job. Now, it was their turn to run. The men barely had time to fire a shot before the bear charged straight for them. Daniel could only watch as chaos erupted in the snow. The poachers scrambled, firing wildly, but the bear was too fast, too powerful. It barreled into them, sending one man crashing to the ground. The leader turned, eyes wide with fear, and bolted for his snowmobile. Daniel snapped out of his daze. He grabbed his own rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. "Drop it!" The man hesitated, just long enough for the bear to turn toward him again. Realizing he was outmatched, the poacher threw up his hands. All right, he shouted. "Just call it off." Daniel didn't lower the gun. "You're gonna call your buddies. Tell them to stand down." The man nodded frantically, reaching for his radio. "We're done! We're leaving!" Slowly, the remaining men stumbled back, dragging their injured partner with them. Moments later, the snowmobiles roared to life, speeding off into the darkness, leaving Daniel alone with the bear, and a truth neither of them could ignore. The bear stood in the snow, breath visible in the freezing air. Its wounds still ached, but it no longer trembled from exhaustion. For the first time in a long time, it was free. Daniel lowered his gun, exhaling shakily. "Well, big guy," he murmured, "guess that settles that." The bear turned to him, its massive form silhouetted against the moonlit snow. And then, in a moment Daniel would never forget, it bowed its head, not in fear, not in defeat, but in gratitude. Then, without another sound, it turned toward the forest and disappeared into the wild, where it belonged. Days later, Daniel contacted wildlife authorities, reporting the poachers and the bear's survival. It wasn't long before the authorities confirmed what he suspected. The bear had been part of an illegal trafficking operation. Daniel's stand against the poachers had saved more than just one animal. It had exposed an entire underground network. Because of that night, more than a dozen poachers were arrested. A smuggling ring was shut down, and Daniel, he became a legend. A man who had once lived in quiet solitude had become the guardian of something much greater. And though he never saw the bear again, every winter when the snowstorms rolled in, he found massive paw prints near his cabin, a silent reminder that some bonds, no matter how impossible, could never be broken.